old, but as long as the mic is working, we will work around that. I couldn't think of another word. Let's see here. So welcome, come on in, because we have announcements to share. And also, I apologize in advance for any coughing that occurs, because it probably will. But if it's your first time joining live, hello. We have front splits or just splits for beginners. Yay! Talking about ways that I think helpful if you are a beginner to get into it. If you would like a free class, free on the house, DM the account Stretch It app live, and you will get that free class. Not in the chat, but make sure you DM the account. We have our standing splits challenge tomorrow, and we have our Stretch It global competition that I failed to mention in our last live. So thank you so much for reading the comment I left on that post. And it started on the 6th, but we're running it through March 6th. And prizes include an iPhone 16, gift certificates as well. So make sure you check out the details. If you're already a subscriber to the app, you will see that prompt when opening. And if you want to get in on the fun, you gotta be. Look at this renegade twist that just wants to do, and it doesn't want to stay down. It wants to live its own life. Okay. Splits for beginners. Where do I begin? But let me allow the. What is this, Alicia? Let the chat run for a bit so you can get comfortable, and I'll show a few exercises during our live together. I don't think I could wear these tops anymore. They're too small. I know that was such a tangent comment. But before I begin, I want to see if there were any specific questions before we get into front splits. I'll let the chat run for a bit, but also I think it's important to get acquainted with your hips movement capacity, meaning if there are any limitations in hip flexion, rotation, abduction, adduction, extension. And if you know that, you'll be able to better program, or more specifically choose the classes on the app. Maybe you have to focus on a little more hip extension versus flexion. How would you warm up before stretching? Any physical activity that's going to increase your body temperature and also increase blood flow. That could be jump rope. That could be going on the bike for a few minutes. If you want to do body weight squats, lunges, something that's going to work up a light type of a sweat. If you want to just stick to stretching, then you have to move dynamically in and out. Hi, Kafkaesque. Any reason why low squatting with a wide stance is so much easier than with the legs closer together? Well, it's because in a wider stance, you are relying on this down angle of the hip to get lower versus knees going forward beyond your toe line. And typically, from a technical perspective, that's tougher. And I just want to show this to Kafkaesque. That very much could transition to our splits. And also, how do you know if the hip immobility is extension or flexion? I will let you know for sure. But just to address the squat issue, people have an easier time squatting back than they do putting the knees forward. And that requires ankle mobility, right? Because now you have to express force from your ankles with the deeper flexed position to come up, versus with your butt back, you're using both your back and your hips to get up. That's why in powerlifting, people usually opt for the low bar position and they sit back with wider legs, because you just move more weight that way. because you could utilize more of your posterior chain to get weight higher, to get the weight up, versus high bar positions, a lot more technical, where now you are using quads most primarily versus glutes and in some capacity adductors. Now, for the extension flexion question, this is I would rely on CARs, which are the circular angular rotations from FRC. They are not just joint circles, but an entire system that you use to evaluate your joint's work capacity. You could do this standing or on your side, but I'm going to do this standing because I think it's a little easier to see. If you hold on to something, and I would suggest that you start with your leg in front, it's slightly turned out from the hip. Now, as you start to open your hip out, you then rotate it, but this is the part people have a hard time with. If you're unable to extend without arching your back, then that is an indication that you have limited hip extension. If you're starting from your hip extension, if you're unable to lift your thigh high enough to create that deep hip flexion position, but you have to lean back to accommodate that movement, then you have limited hip flexion. If you're arching and you're leaning back for both, then we have to work on both. But we'll go over all that today. Okay? Don't mind me. I just want to scroll through. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to temporarily pause on these comments so we can get into beginning stretches. I'll turn them back on after the live or after the lesson is over. One of my main focuses when it comes to getting beginners to train splits, and in this case front splits, is to get acquainted with their hip extension, because that's what a split is, in my opinion. A front split is an extended low lunge, right? Except now your back knee and your front knee are straight, but your pelvis is the same. Well, we are working towards that, or we hope that it's more or less the same. And what I mean by that is, when you get into your lunge position, you now want to establish, okay, can I extend? Can I feel my hip flexor stretch without using my low back, right? And often beginners might find it difficult to distinguish the two. They might not be able to feel the difference between punching your hip forward or tilting it versus using their back to move their hip forward, right? So that's why I like them to start in the 90-90 position, so they can actually feel their hip extension, or more specifically, they can feel their hip flexor stretch. Cool. So let's get back into that 90-90. And if it's your first time doing this, I would hold on to a wall or something where you're just more stable and you could pour more effort into extending the hip. You want to think belly button back and try to make this as compact as you can. Shoot. Try to get the angles here. Feeling the stretch down in your hip flexor, and you can go in and out of it just to ease into the sensation here. And once you become acquainted, you keep punching that hip forward and you hold. You keep holding. You could do a side bend here if you want. Lots of different options. Now, I would master this first, because the other stretch that I think I showed last week, I can't remember. The other stretch is to use a block and a wall, or a bed, but my bed's a mess right now. You don't want to see that. So I'm placing a block near the wall, knee on the block, foot on the wall, other foot forward, and now you're trying to get as flush to the wall as you can. Oof, getting that hip back and situating the pelvis in the same way that we try to in that 90-90 position. Punch that hip forward and focus on getting this hip crease as flat as possible. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this position is because if we were to return low lunge, and I could grab 2 blocks just to support the shape, 1 block either side, again, it's just how much extension you can get from that back hip. That's going to be the cornerstone of your front split training. Now let's go to hamstrings. As a beginner, I would start hamstring stretching on the back. And the reason why is because you could stretch your hamstrings a variety of ways. You can do it standing by folding forward, but if you feel like you are limited by your hip flexion and you can't get a nice tilt in the pelvis to actually stretch the hamstrings, then you will ultimately need to come down. But if you can't establish that same hip tilt with a seated position, it can also prove difficult. However, if you can lie down, this is a lot more accessible. Even if you have to use a prop, some type of strap, TheraBand, whatever you have at your disposal, wrap it around your foot. Even if you keep your knee bent, it's just a lot easier to feel, and you don't have to worry so much of where your pelvis is in space when you're lying down. And typically with beginners, it's more so the important stage is to get connected with their bodies. Feel the tissues that they're looking to stretch. Know that they're stretching the hamstrings, right? Know that you're stretching the quads. Know that you're stretching your hip flexors, right? Because as someone who's pretty in tune with their body, I take that for granted. I do. Because if I try to work with someone that does not have the same background as me, I can't assume that they're going to have those same connections. And I can't assume that those connections will come easily either. So that's why I try to suggest these exercises from that lens. If you have issues connecting with these body parts, with these sensations, I think these are the positions that are going to help cultivate that connection in the most successful way, right? Now, that's not going to be the case all the time. Maybe even if you're a beginner, maybe you still connect with this stretch versus you lying on the floor, right? There's always going to be these outlying situations. But I think on average, focusing again on the 90-90 position for hip flexor flexibility, advancing it to the wall stretch or the couch stretch, as it is also called, and then going into your hamstring stretches is going to help definitely work on your front split. Now, for middles, oh me oh my, middles is complicated because of the hip position, a lot of rotation that goes into it. And if your knees are like this and you can't tilt your pelvis in a meaningful way, you might have to introduce weights. You might have to introduce loaded eccentrics, because we got to get beyond the red stuff and more of the white tissue stuff, like the ligaments and tendons that are particularly holding you hostage, and use those training protocols to get deeper into that range of motion, right? Just stretching and holding is not going to cut it, depending on who you are, right? And some people do feel that there is something wrong with their hip because they can't do a middle split. Well, yes, there is something with your hip that's preventing you from completely opening your legs. But there's not a muscle that attaches one leg to the other, right? And if you can get one leg to rotate, you can technically get the other one to rotate as well. We just have to identify what the restriction is and work on that specifically. I wouldn't lose hope. One of my clients has a really tight butterfly, so I would recommend that she put weight plates on, whether they're the flat plates or kettlebells or dumbbells, or I would also suggest to do more of the eccentric loading when you're 90-90 and really working this hip flexion and abduction. So I could go on and on and on. And when it comes to the inner thighs, which for middle splits, there are two kinds. There is the classic straddle, where your legs are turned out, the knees are forward, and you lean. And then there's middle, where you rotate the pelvis, and the knees are pointing forward. I would get acquainted with frog first before you even think about straightening the legs. And just as a reminder, frog is when the knees are wide, you're leaning forward. Make sure your feet are out so they're right under your knees. And you don't want to just sink into the back here. You want to hold your torso pretty neutral so you can focus your effort in lowering the hips. Again, not by arching, but by targeting the inner thighs as well as the abduction that's going on with your hip joint. And just getting comfortable here. Now, if you're really uncomfortable, because again, I'm used to that position, I've done it for years, you might have to start on the wall, where I'm just going to pretend the wall extends beyond this point, where you put your feet on and you just rest your feet there and just rely on gravity to place a little weight here to the inner thighs. And the reason why I say that is because as a beginner, your stretch tolerance might be on the lower end. So you then will have to, yes, not only work on your range of motion, but you have to condition your nervous system to accept these new sensations that you're introducing to your body and to not be afraid. That's another part of the training too. As a beginner, it's just getting acquainted with being uncomfortable. Uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean painful. However, the more you train, the more you're able to decipher the two, because they do feel different, right? Uncomfortable is not necessarily painful, although to a beginner, they intersect. They do. I get that completely. But again, once you get familiar with these sensations, with these experiences, you can start to comb them out. But that comes with practice. But usually I like to suggest the easiest variation, because from a psychological standpoint, you don't want to start with the stretch that completely wrecks you, because you're just less likely to do it again, right? You don't want to go through that again, and the incentive is just not worth it. You're like, I'm so high off the ground and this hurts like hell. Like, why do I want to do this again? Please explain. Excuse me. Water. So that's why I suggest you go on your back for the frog stretch if you haven't done that stretch at all. At all. And once you get comfortable with going on your back and opening the knees, then you maybe start flipping it and then doing the stretch on your elbows. You see what I'm saying? See what I'm saying? Because we have time. There's no reason to rush into the hardest variation right away when you haven't even stretched a day in your life. So don't feel like you gotta rush this thing. You know what I'm saying? I would also focus on hamstring stretching too for your middle splits because your hamstrings do play a role in that position. So don't feel like if you're wasting time stretching your hamstrings but you want to get your middle splits. No, it all contributes. It all contributes. And I would also work on your hip capsule capacity, right? That demonstration I did at the beginning, and I could do it again, where you're looking to get or isolate what is now my right hip joint, focusing on moving just the hip joint and not anything else. It's really hard. It's really hard. But as you advance, you put these, conditions or barriers on yourself to make the rotation tougher. For an example, I'm trying my absolute hardest to not move my standing hip joint because I just want to mobilize my right hip joint. As a beginner, you might end up moving your standing hip. You might move your torso a little bit because, one, if you haven't done the movement before, it's not going to be perfect, nor will it ever be at the beginning. So it's just a matter of practice. But when you get familiar with the movement and then you understand the point of it, that's when you start to put those conditions and say, okay, before, when I was practicing my hip cars, I kind of shifted a little bit because I wasn't quite used to it and my hip joint was quite tight and it was uncomfortable. But once you started to practice this, let's say every day, because you can, you now are able to keep or remain more upright and truly isolate your hip joint in a way that does not involve the rest of the body. And I also like to brace my hand here on my low spine to ensure that it does not interfere, especially with the hip extension, because that's tough for a lot of people. A lot of people. And doing the hip cars is also a great way, as I mentioned before, to evaluate what you need to work on. It also sheds light and it kind of lessens the a little bit of anxiousness for someone who, if they feel discouraged about how they can't get into a split, or they tried it and it hurt, or they did this stretch and that stretch and nothing seemed to work, hip cars can help probably clarify what that is. It can help zero in on where the restriction is, right? If you felt like you couldn't get down on the split, right, working on your front splits, for instance, let me just do the other side, and you finally practice this hip car that I showed you, you're going around and around, and then when you get here, you start to arch, and you can't even extend the hip without arching. Well, that's an indication that we gotta isolate that hip extension a lot better. And once you do that, it's almost like everything then unleashes. It's like, oh, that makes sense. So I just want to break down a few things before I run questions. I also wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. I have to just message my client to say I'm going to be a little late. Finishing. Will be on soon. Okay. Let me scroll back up to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. So to cover, when you're doing splits from a beginner's perspective, choose the easier exercise first. Get acquainted with what we're trying to stretch, hold it, and then advance from there. What if you experience lower back pain after stretching? Is that abnormal? I can't answer that because I don't have any context. I don't know what the stretch is. I don't know what your low back history is. I wouldn't say is abnormal typically because stretching is pretty low effort and low intensity, depending on. I'm pretty steady in my hip cars, but it's not easy to open my hip to the size. Yeah, that could be just, that used to be a lot for me as well. And I think practicing, if you want it Kafkaesque, have you tried this on the side where you could place a block under your head, have a weight here just to stabilize the body, and see if that is a little easier. Oh, it's tough, but maybe that will help you focus on improving that abduction. You could also try putting on an ankle weight. You could also try just isolating the abduction, so just working through that degree versus doing the whole hip car. Everyday hip cars are fine, yes. And remember, if you would like a free class, DM our account the word live. Standing splits challenge starts tomorrow. And make sure you participate in our competition. Oh, good, Kafkaesque. Words today are challenging. Lying down is a lot of fun, especially if you have like a kettlebell or something to anchor the entire body so you could generate enough force to truly isolate that rotation. It's killer. Or holding on to a squat rack, that will help as well. And if you are watching the replay and me just staring at the screen is because this is live, just want to make sure I don't miss anyone's questions. But we are near the end in a bit. I just wanted to hold on for a minute more. You guys like the Crocs? These are my house Crocs. We got Demon Slayer gibbets on there. Now we need a stretch it gibbet. You are welcome. And I'm sorry about the voice. Sorry. All right, everyone. If that is it for splits, thank you for joining. And we have our agenda for the rest of January, so I'm excited. Again, DM the Stretch It account live for a free class if you like. Standing splits challenge begins tomorrow. And make sure you join our global competition that's running through March 6th. Hello, it is our Standing Splits Challenge. You can find out more if you click link in bio for details. Thank you, Bendy Ninja. Always great to have you. Super. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for taking the time. Hopefully, I'll be able to see you next Sunday. And until then, please take care.